Hello, I'm Maria Hall Brown, and this is LA Currents. Drama, intrigue, controversy, the story of the general election of 2020. Well, here to tell us how the California chapter played out, I am delighted to welcome back California Secretary of State Alex Padilla. So nice to see you again.
Thank you, Maria. Good to be back. And that was all the lead into the election, but I'm glad to say the outcome was smooth.
Absolutely.
Successful.
Okay, so last time we spoke, we were talking about the fact that all the ballots were going to be mailed to all the citizens who were eligible to vote here in California and how the polling places were going to work out. And that was all hopeful in theory, but ultimately it worked out exceptionally well.
Right. Despite the challenges, despite the threats and attacks, and despite a lot of election disinformation out there, the 2020 general election was enormously successful. It was the most secure election just as we were hoping for, and also very smooth. You know, little issues here and there throughout the state of California, but by and large, a very smooth, positive experience for a record number of voters.
Over 70% or something like that?
Right. We came into the election with more than 22 million voters on the rolls. That's a big increase from just 4 years ago. And a record number of Californians cast their ballot, nearly 17.8 million ballots cast. To give you reference on both of those statistics, for voter registration, we now have more voters in California than there are people in the state of Florida. For all the attention Florida gets every presidential election, there's more voters in California than people in Florida. Los Angeles County now has more than a 90% registration rate of all eligible voters. I think they rank second in the state of California. Huge progress. And as we know, registering people to vote is only half the battle. How do we make sure they do vote? We changed the multiple options for how people can vote. And the previous record for voter turnout was 14.6 million in the last presidential contest in 2016. This year, 17.8, so wow. Big increase.
Wow. All right, but as we said, the election was November 3rd, but the race isn't over until each of the states certify the results of the election. So this is all an education for us these days because so many things we didn't pay attention to in the past. So that's your responsibility. So what is certifying the election here in California?
Right. No, I appreciate the question because this is important, right? We said it a lot going into the election because we knew that if nothing else, the presidential contest was probably going to be close in a number of other states, and that's exactly what happened. Right. So the mantra was election night does not equal results night.
No.
On election night, historically speaking, we do have a pretty good sense as to how most contests are going to turn out, so who's likely to win, who's not. But for close contests and for final results, it takes time. And in California, it literally takes several weeks to finish processing ballots, counting the votes, and even conducting the post-election audits that are required to ensure the accuracy and the integrity of the results. But let me be specific so people have a real appreciation for what I'm talking about. In California, the law says somebody who's voting by mail, they can, what's the deadline to return your vote by mail ballot? It used to be, had to be in the hands of the elections folks on election night. Now, as long as it's mailed on or before election day, postmarked on or before election day, it can arrive after and still be counted. We extended that deadline just in case there was any of the delays at the Postal Service that we had been anticipating. We don't want people to lose their right to vote through no fault of their own. So, the night of the election, we have a good idea, but ballots are still going to arrive for several days, and they deserve to be counted. Another example, for people who do vote by mail, when those ballots arrive, they're not counted right away. Elections officials need to verify the identity of the voter, one of our safeguards and protections against voter fraud. So that takes another bit of time to compare the signatures on the return envelope, the signatures on file for the voter, to confirm identity before those envelopes are opened, before those ballots are processed and the votes are counted. So a lot of work in the weeks after the election, but once all that is done, and for a record number, it took a little bit longer, we can officially certify these are the results.
All right, so there were some safeguards that we talked about before prior to the election in regards to making sure that the eligible voter is in fact the one who voted. There were barcodes on both the ballot and the envelope and the signatures and everything like that. So in the process of certifying, did all of that work, making sure that everybody was who they said they were and making sure they didn't have multiple options at being able to vote? because there have been accusations out there that there were some anomalies that needed to be thought and addressed.
So the truth is, it worked. It worked like a charm. All those measures in place to protect the integrity of the elections in general, but vote by mail specifically, since the vast majority of Californians who voted by mail. So whether it's the paper types we talked about on ballot printing, no counterfeit ballots were identified. The barcodes that allow not just the confirmation of the voter, because every return ballot has to come in its official envelope, but it enabled ballot tracking, right? Another transparency and accountability tool. I talked about ballot tracking when I was last here. I encouraged people to sign up for it. More than 5 million Californians voluntarily signed up to track their ballot through the mail and get those confirmation messages when their ballot was received and counted. And so, yes, the safeguards work like a charm, but I want to give special credit to our efforts to educate the public about the changes that were anticipated. We did all the legwork, working with county officials and other organizations to shift to more vote by mail, still provide in-person voting options, multiple days of in-person voting, different locations, reminders to bring their mask, etc. Those would all have been for naught if voters weren't aware of the new options they had for voting and protecting their health during the pandemic. So we invested in an aggressive voter education campaign, and it seems to have paid off.
Now, California, every state, it's almost like there's 10, there's all these different elections across the country. It's not just, even though it's a general election, every state has its own rules and regs, and every state has its own policies when it comes to the election. So California's policies did not necessarily look like Texas, did not necessarily look like Florida, as you mentioned. So all of these different certification processes, is California ahead of the other states, do you feel? Do you think we had a more sophisticated process than perhaps some other states, and perhaps they'll mirror us in the future?
Let's see, as respectfully as I can say this, I wish a lot more states looked like California does when it comes to access to the ballot, right? Accessibility to our democracy, of course, election security as well. We've taken all the excuses off the table for all the reforms that we've championed. Beginning with voter registration. It's not just a matter of finding the form at the post office or the library anymore. You can register to vote online. We register a lot of people automatically through the DMV when they're applying for renewing their driver's license or their state ID. Even if you miss all the official deadlines, you can still show up in person and participate in same-day registration. Some of these are available in other states, but not all, and very few states have all the options for registering to vote that we have in California. So I'm not surprised that we've done as great as we have when it comes to increasing registration numbers and registration rates. For actual voting, we saw a lot of other states expand vote by mail for the first time this year. In some states, they offer vote by mail, but it's very limited. You have to be a certain age or prove you are sick or are going to be out of town to be able to vote by mail. That's not the case in California. We have the measures in place to safeguard the integrity of vote by mail, so why not let everybody take advantage of it just because of convenience as well as security? And that's played a big part in getting the participation levels that we've had, and it made even more sense during the COVID-19 pandemic. No safer way to protect your health and cast your ballot than to do it from the comfort and safety of your own home. But we had the in-person options for voters who needed it. Again, other states have done some of it. Very few have done as much as we have, and I certainly hope that the success of the election in California and elsewhere continues the momentum for these reforms nationally.
All right, so now we've gotten through the pretty straightforward popular vote component, but that's only the first piece of the puzzle, because the next is the Electoral College. And the Electoral College has been discussed, rediscussed, analyzed, looked at, but in a very real way, once the popular vote for all the states has been certified and counted. Now the Electoral College is the one that steps in. So in California, who chooses who represents the Electoral College.
Right. This is the question I get every time I visit a high school and say every
Absolutely.
vote matters. There's a kid in the back who raises their hand and says, "But what about the Electoral College?" Right? And so, yes, written into the Constitution is this structure only for the presidential elections, but it is for the presidential election, the most high-profile, most important contest of all. And so every state has a certain number of electoral votes, right? We've all seen that on the news in the last several weeks, determined by our share of the population, right? Yet another reason why the census was so important this year. It determines how many Electoral College votes each state gets. In California, we currently have 55. The electors are selected by the congressional representatives. It's district by district, and each of the U.S. senators has a selection as well. And the rules are they go in California, and they vote for the winner of the popular vote in California. So it may be indirect, but I can tell every high school student out there and anybody else, yes, your vote matters, because the popular vote in California determines how the electors in California will cast their ballot for president on December 14th.
That's not necessarily the same in other states.
Most states are pretty
Electors,
similar, but
okay.
yes, each state is a little bit different. But at the end of the day, the states do have the electoral votes cast for the winners of the election in their particular states.
So then what is a faithless elector?
Faithless electors, there's been a legal question that actually was addressed by the Supreme Court of the United States this year. Let's say hypothetically, there's an elector that was selected that just personally disagreed with, the winner of the presidential election in their particular state. Could they change their vote and cast it for somebody else? And the answer has now been clarified. No, there hasn't been issues historically, not enough faithless electors to change the outcome of an election or to cause a constitutional crisis, but now they are bound to go with the rules of their particular state.
So across the country, secretaries of state across the country are now certifying the election, and as far as the court cases are concerned and everything like that, has there been any impediment? Is anything not going as one would have thought?
Well, I'll tell you twofold. One, the official process itself continues to go smoothly, and I think that's not just demonstrated in the certification of elections in a number of states. Everybody has a different timetable, but the result of the litigation, right? We've seen a lot of lawsuits filed trying to interrupt the vote counting process or the certification process, all of them failing to interrupt the certification of the results that most of Americans realize are the real results. What hasn't been so smooth, I got to be honest, is the impact of some of the disinformation out there that has led to threats to some of my colleagues. Elections officials at the state and local level in a number of states being victimized by intimidation, harassment, even threats in their homes from people who are choosing to accept or believe the result of the election because of disinformation that continues to be spewed, not just on social media, but especially on social media. So, we still have our work cut out, not just to deliver smooth, safe elections, but to continue to communicate in a transparent way that people, whether they like the results of the election or not, accept the results and have confidence in those results.
This is probably an unanswerable question, but how is it even possible that there could be some sort of collusion in such a grand scale that would sway an election of this scope? And what are some of the myths that are out there that, as you just very aptly said, need to be completely debunked?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's simply common sense. If you really are genuinely concerned about the integrity of the process, then pay close attention, right? Every question is answerable, and the process itself is very transparent. Very few people realize that despite our invitations, anybody who wants to observe the ballot processing at every county in every state, they can do so. Just call the local elections officials and make arrangements to come in and observe. But the folks that peddle in conspiracy theories, of course, don't say that and don't participate in that opportunity. Before certifying elections, it's not just a matter of counting the votes once, but auditing the results in a way that gives the statistical confidence that the results are accurate. So for folks who are generally interested, that's fine. But let's also look at some practical arguments here. We saw the results of the national election, right? President Biden will become president on January 20th. If people thought there really was a conspiracy theory going on, why didn't the same folks behind it also flip the Senate? Or flip more legislative seats or governorships or what have you. So, if you stop and think about it, no, there was no conspiracy at play here. The process is one filled with checks and balances, and we stand by the accuracy and the integrity of the results.
So the audits, when you do audits, and are you taking a percentage of the ballots from a random set of piles to sort of double check and triple check?
Yes, so California law requires every county to conduct a post-election audit after every election before certifying the results. And for a long time, that meant taking a percentage of the precincts and doing a hand count to make sure that it aligns with the machine count. Because sometimes if the machine's inaccurate, you need to verify that. We're at a minimum doing that. Some counties are moving in the direction of what we call a risk limiting audit. It's fancy math talk for, in close contests, you want to count more ballots, not the landslide contest. You can be sure who the winner is there, but in close contests, you may want to count more ballots to be extra sure on the outcome of the election. Of course, anybody has the option of requesting a recount in California, and those are done manually as well. But I think we've done such a good job of counting the ballots right the first time. There's less and less of a need for a recount in the close elections.
Well, this has all been really, really great news, but I know for a fact there must have been some hurdles and challenges that you had to go through. So, this was a great experiment, considering it was probably the most stressful environment that could possibly be, new changes, really, really tough election in the middle of a pandemic. I don't think the stakes could have been any higher if you had even had a Hollywood screenwriter try to write it for you. So, but there must have been some challenges and hurdles and things that you will want to make adjustments for, or whomever is sitting in your chair wants to make adjustments for in the near future. So where do you see there are some opportunities to advance?
Yeah, I think one of the ongoing challenges is going to be, sadly, in elections going forward, is the threat and danger of election disinformation.
Right.
Those who want to continue to try to manipulate, create chaos by echoing bad information about how to register to vote or how to vote or the integrity of the results. There's outright lies and conspiracy theories that continue to propagate, and they need to be countered on a consistent basis. So that's going to continue to be an issue, not just for elections officials, but I think for every citizen, right? Let's verify something before you believe just anything you come across on social media. If you have questions or need information, go to official sources, your county elections office or the Secretary of State's office or website. That's one. If there was one specific issue that created some attention this year, it's the use of unofficial ballot drop boxes.
Absolutely.
We read about that in different parts of the state. When we mailed every active registered voter a ballot by mail, we reminded them they have multiple opportunities for how to return it by mail, to an official ballot drop box, or dropping it off in person, or designated somebody that they know and trust to return their ballot for them. Sadly, we saw some entities put up unauthorized, unofficial drop boxes, labeled them deceptively as official initially, caused a little confusion, caused a little concern. We had to take legal action. That activity was ceased and desisted, but it did create a little bit of that confusion early on. So if we need to make it abundantly clear what is or isn't allowed in terms of ballot collection activity, then I think that's something for the legislature to tackle in 2021.
Were there a lot of ballots deposited in those boxes, and were you able to retrieve them and make sure that they were appropriately?
Yeah, not a ton at the end of the day. We're assured that they were all promptly delivered to their respective county elections offices for processing and counting. We did have to do extra work in those areas to remind voters of their multiple safe and secure options for returning their ballot, and if any voter believed they may have delivered their ballot to an unofficial drop box, knowingly or unknowingly, to sign up for the ballot tracking tool. It's one of the specific pieces of value for tracking your ballot. You get that confirmation message when your ballot is received by the county and counted. So if you thought you delivered your ballot and you're not getting that confirmation from the county, you can make arrangements for either reissuing a ballot or somehow making sure your vote gets counted.
Another good reason to track your ballot, because there was actually some sad vandalism to one of the official ballot boxes as well.
Right, there was that, and again, thankfully, given the specs that official drop boxes have, the damage to the ballots themselves was minimal. They were able to contact all the voters to make sure they knew that either the ballot was going to be counted or they had to be reissued a ballot so they can have their vote counted in the election. But another good example, official drop boxes, only counties can deploy because they have to meet certain specifications in terms of their construction, in terms of their installation, protocols on how frequently ballots are retrieved. You don't have those protections or guarantees with unofficial, unauthorized drop boxes.
All right, so you did it. Congratulations. In theory, we're on the other side of this. You've certified the election. Our electoral votes will, go as planned. But then there's some things are going to shift because it's an election year. So what's happening up in Sacramento? What's changing up there? And especially now since we are currently, sadly, as we speak right now, still dealing with the issue of the pandemic. So what's happening up in Sacramento? How is everybody doing and what's happening in moving chairs, et cetera?
Right, so the election is now being certified and the new legislative session has just begun as well. So a lot of returning state assembly members and state senators, more than a handful of new legislators joining the crowd. And I think their to-dos are going to be a continuation of 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to impact California tremendously from both a health perspective and an economic perspective, right? And even things like homeschooling for so many families throughout the state. So I think that's going to continue to be the singular primary focus of proposed legislation in 2021.
And so what are some of the things that you're focused on right now? What are some of the things that you're concerned with, in making sure that, in the Secretary of State, big sigh of relief, election is passed, but that doesn't mean the job is passed. So
no, it doesn't.
Got a lot to do.
First of all, as an agency like other state departments and agencies, we have to take a hard look at the budget. Given the down economy, we know that state and local government budgets are being impacted. So we may have grand ideas and wishes for new projects and new technology and new initiatives, but with limited resources, we're going to have to be very, very frugal, if you will. I think if there's one silver lining of the pandemic when it comes to the workplace, is we realized how much can be done and done well with a lot of remote work being done. Not everybody has to show up in the office in person every single day. So as the vaccine is on the horizon and the new normal we hope to reach sooner rather than later, I don't think we're going to go back to the same way of doing business as we had prior to the pandemic. I think there's going to be maybe a hybrid version of still folks coming into an office as often as they need to, but with more of an allowance for people to work remotely, work from home, be more flexible in what that work structure looks like. We have a responsibility of government to maintain all the essential functions and services that we provide, but if our employees have more flexibility in how to deliver that, then maybe that's a good thing that comes out of all this.
Do you think that there are more efficiencies happening? Do you think government is streamlining somewhat because of what's gone on, that, this adaptation has created some red tape cutting?
I think when we look back on this, maybe in a year from now, we'll certainly find some of those success stories. We're learning in real time, sort of doing those assessments. If you stop and think about it, it's been, about 9 months of the pandemic. It's flown by. We've been through a lot. So I think after first of the year, when we look back at 2020, what worked, what didn't, to want to make some adjustments, I'm sure it wasn't all smooth and perfect, but a lot that we would have learned from that will inform, how we do things going forward.
All right, this is a vague and general question, but it's still, so there are positions that are moving and left vacant. Who makes the decision about, how people might shift? And is it like a job interview, or is it just someone gets a phone call one night and says, well, Michelle Steele is now, moved, so therefore someone can move into that position? How does that work? How does that non-election shifting take place?
Right, you're very kind. The terminology I tend to hear more is musical chairs.
There you go. I was trying to be more official.
Well, there's a couple different, categories, if you will. Two very high-profile vacancies that are on the verge of being created. One in the United States Senate. All right, our current Senator Kamala Harris is now Vice President-elect Harris. And
She
come
is
January
indeed.
20th, she'll be the Vice President of the United States, creating a vacancy in the United States Senate. Our Attorney General, Javier Becerra, has been nominated by President-elect Biden to serve as the next Secretary for Health and Human Services. So assuming he's confirmed, that creates a vacancy in the position of Attorney General in California. For those positions, under California law, the governor appoints. So a big decision for him to make. It's up to him to determine the process or the timing of those decisions. But it's for the governor to decide. For others, whether it's a vacancy created in the House of Representatives because somebody got elected to a different position, or even the legislature because somebody got elected to a different position, then in all likelihood there will be a special election called by the governor for the voters to decide who should fill those spots.
Back to the appointments. Does he do it in a vacuum, or does he actually call people up and say, are you interested? Or does he, I mean, how does he manage that? And then when it comes to some of the other positions that are going to be vacated, even with, you know, President-elect Biden's cabinet and who he's bringing in, the special elections, what's the timeline of that?
Yeah, so the special elections are easier to answer because California law does provide, you know, a certain timetable. Once the vacancy is created, you know, the special election has to take place no less than a certain number of days and no more than a certain number of days. So the Elections Division in the Secretary of State's office plays that technical support role to advise the governor, well, here's your options in terms of the dates, you know, for the primary in the special election and a runoff if necessary, and a recommendation, right? Is it sooner? Is it later? We want to avoid, you know, national holidays and things of that nature. For the others, where it's straight a gubernatorial appointment, you'd have to ask the governor what his process is.
Okay.
For better and for worse, there's nothing official, nothing required. I'm sure there's a lot that he's weighing in terms of considerations, but ultimately it's his decision to make, and we respect it when he does.
So when history looks back on the general election for 2020, what do you think, beyond the controversy? Because I was being a little flip when I introduced the fact that we were here together. I mean, it was quite a dramatic story. I think if somebody had written it, nobody would have believed it until we experienced it. But what do you think are going to be the highlights and the lowlights of this particular election year?
Yeah, look, I think at the end of the day, much more highlight than not. But let me set the stage for it. Right? We came into 2020 already with the political environment telling us this would be the most consequential election of our lifetime. A lot at stake. A lot of issues that you cared about were on the line, regardless of your political leanings. And then we were hit with the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And I mentioned the health impacts, the economic impacts, the impact to our daily life. This summer was an intense summer after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Issues not just of the criminal justice system and use of force by law enforcement, but inequities and discrimination and racism, systemic racism across the board, across all areas of society. We saw the powerful demonstrations and protests throughout the country this summer, making, again, the stakes of this November's election even higher. And then we saw the threats to our elections, primarily through disinformation, conspiracy theories, et cetera. So we were up against a lot. And to think that not just in California, but across the country, we saw record registration in many, many states, record turnout in many, many states, record early voting in many, many states. In the midst of significant changes to how we administer the elections, I think there's a huge, tremendous success story to be told there, and I hope we've laid a foundation for a lot of this to be permanent shifts, not just one-time affairs. So states that might have been resistant to vote by mail did it because of the COVID-19 pandemic. If it was successful, you know, let's continue that progress. For the in-person voting, you know, you covered some of the innovative voting locations in California,
Absolutely.
like Staples Center and Dodger Stadium,
Right.
and the Forum, et cetera. You know, those were great. They stepped up during this unique time and during this crisis, but that's not to say we can't do it there again. So a lot of outcomes, you know, of this crisis that we hope are good bits of news to continue.
And looking forward to 2021, I'm hoping you are. I imagine that it's going to be, a great year all around. Vaccine on the horizon, you know, pandemic hopefully in our rearview mirror.
Yeah, as soon as Dr. Fauci gives the vaccine the thumbs up, we'll get in the appropriate line to take it, right? That's part of the conversation is, not just when the vaccine may be approved, but who should be amongst the first to get it. Completely agree. It's got to be our frontline health workers, all the doctors and nurses that have demonstrated their courage and their service and their commitment throughout the course of the year. Other firefighters and first responders. But of course, the next is the most vulnerable populations, the elderly, people with underlying conditions. So eventually, we'll all get to the vaccination, I hope, and get this COVID-19 pandemic behind us.
And that's a wrap on this LA Currents.